The first reading comes from one of the most mystical of the Old Testament prophets. No one has quite understood all that was being seen by Ezekiel. The suggestiveness there comes through, and that's what we can keep. We have, as it were, not prose, but poetry, and poetry is based on suggestion, not fact. And something of that comes through pretty well all the time in mystical language. We notice also that certain expressions are ancient and suggest power and majesty. We have here the very ancient form, like the voice of Shaddai, it says. That is an ancient Semitic word which suggests something hugely strong, rock-like, and powerful. Well, that something strong, rock-like, and powerful is the force that sustains the world, and that the Lord, as the second person of the Trinity, is applying and using and indicating by what is all, for us, by now familiar, but for them was a very big surprise. What happens when he's asked about the question of the tax? Well, it's Simon Peter who has to answer the question directly. Does the master pay it? And of course that is putting both in a spot. Remember now that the whole principle of what irritated the Lord a lot in the practice of money changing in the temple area was actually in itself made necessary by the fact that they were unwilling to have coins with a godlike human emperor on it coming there into the place of God, and therefore they had to change coins into something which was okay. It would have had something very much Hebrew, like the menorah on it. But the problem is that it had become a very noisy business in the very precincts of the house of God, and that was the bit that was out of control. But we need to be aware of all this because they were handling a difficult situation there. It was occupied territory, not that difficult from what we had only a generation or so ago in the time of the war, when great chunks of France were occupied by Germans. So it was a hostile atmosphere and tensions were high and things could explode, especially in that Middle Eastern situation. And the Lord himself chose, remember, out of the 12, one who was slightly into that kind of thing. Remember, Simon the what? Zealot. That was what it was about. And it was a pretty dangerous situation to be involved in. So the answer wasn't simple. Do we pay or not? Remember, in a parallel passage we have something similar coming through with regard to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. He asks to see a coin. So that's one which solves that problem, but this one is slightly different. It's actually the half shekel, and it's something which is directly orientated towards the Hebrew thing. He gets over it, of course, by this miracle which applies his foreknowledge and the power of God. He tells Simon Peter what to do, and by the way, he calls him not Cephas or Peter here, but Simon, which is still being used quite a few times. It comes out unexpectedly here and there, both in the Gospels and in the Acts. And at one point it comes out even in Hebrew form, Simeon. It's during the Council of Jerusalem, when the Bishop of Jerusalem, James, indicates something using that form, Simeon. Well, here the Lord indicates that there is no problem that he cannot solve with his providence. Now, I want to zoom into that for a second. A lot of what we do on earth, if we're in the Lord's work, involves the Lord's power and wisdom. And therefore, he's on side and interested in it. And he is available for the solving of the problems linked with it. However, if, for whatever reason, we start to do something of what the Hebrews did, with regard to messing up the sacred, bringing things too close to the Holy of Holies which do not belong to it. In other words, not under the divine lordship but doing our own thing to make it efficacious, businesslike and successful, then the Lord will not necessarily engage that providence and wisdom on our side, but might withdraw it. So this has to be looked at when we find actually that things are not working. We need to ask, am I here under the Lord's lordship? Is the initiative his or mine? If one looks around the Catholic globe, one does see a pattern emerging. Things which are genuinely, and I mean genuinely, honouring the Lord gratuitously, fully, in an authentic and not a human manner, seem to gather momentum without a huge amount of fuss or bother. The Lord just is free to bless and blesses. Communities that do his will do grow. Only the day after tomorrow we'll have 2 more professions up the road in Silverstream. It just happens. Well, if the contrary is not happening, or is happening, that is that people find that the Lord is somehow not sending, then one has to go further upstream. It's useless trying to make up for it with human means. I want to zoom into, therefore, what concerns him directly. The Holy of Holies. It's the place where heaven and earth meet. Here, unfortunately, we have become used to what is actually not always directly willed by God, but only in what we call the permissive will. There is a difference between the positive will of our God and his permissive will. For instance, the Church, in a certain period of history, finds that it has to address issues which came up, not programmed, but came up from whatever source. What does it do? Over the last 50 years, we've seen a pattern of cause and effect. Insist sufficiently, and things will follow. Now, initially, those insistences quite often come from suspect sources. Often sources which are perhaps under also a pressure from the wrong side. Do you know that already in 1925 there was a clear program in the whole underground world of Freemasonry to destroy the Catholic Church, pushed by, of course, the enemy of mankind and of God himself. Satan means the adversary. And they had already prepared a program for action, step by step. And in it were several items which at the time were unthinkable in their realization, but when a certain openness came in the 60s, were able to be pushed. How? Through, obviously it wouldn't be people from their world, but people from our world who were in key positions and able to work upon the situation. Often, however, people who might not have been receiving that inspiration from the Holy of Holies, but from human arguments and dynamics. Because what is perceived on one's knees while looking at the Blessed Sacrament is one thing. What is perceived in a drawer room is another, when actually one hears human arguments to justify a philosophy which is very far from the Sancta Sanctorum. And so we know that there was a huge attack prepared already way back against the sacred. A few years ago, when still in Italy, I made a retreat in Venice with a holy priest who was genuinely a man of God, spending a huge amount of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, and celebrating always the old rite. And I had the use of his high altar, and one time when I was coming off the altar, we had a little talk eventually, and he did mention one thing to me which got me to think. Remembering now that he was somebody who was spending his entire life practically in prayer and vertical ministry. He said to me just like this, I am afraid that I could not share your views with regard to celebrating the present Mass. And he went on, there has been an attack on the sacred, and it cannot be pleasing to our Lord. He left it at that, didn't make any further point, but it was a sobering thought. Now, he knew where I was coming from because he'd spent himself some time in our monastery, which was very orthodox. Everything was in Latin, but it was the present rite. And even then, he could see the dangers that were ahead, and it actually did work as he foresaw. Hyperactivity leading to eventually a caving in of things, taking on everything possible and losing eventually one's peace and quiet in community. It can happen. The Lord can actually somehow not be able to get through to us when we're so busy doing things for him. The element of contemplation then goes on the back burner. Activism. And he told me when I got back to him some years later on the phone, I could see it coming. Interesting. So I park that, but I come back to his point. The attack on the sacred. Now, just look at it. Some here will have seen the tail end of what was the way in which in Ireland, once in church, one knew one was in, as it were, the antechamber of heaven, that it was somehow not exactly as it was outside, that the church was different, and that one had the instinct to behave in a different way. Now, the fact is that it is not just human, that this has been very successfully dismantled in such a way that the human dynamic has in practice taken over. And it is in practice, I say, not in theory but in practice, perceived as little more than a meeting place. What's happened? Those parts of earth which had been programmed by God as extraterritorial, belonging to heaven, as you might have a part of Rome, which is not under Roman authority, Italian authority, but under the Vatican, so too all these parts of earth, the consecrated churches of the earth, had angels assigned to them, and they were God's, and his rights were to be observed there totally, and his honour and glory was to be primary, and it was so. And the protection also to the sacraments was such that people were quite often unwilling to receive Holy Communion easily. They were aware of what it was, and they preferred to receive rarely but well. So, just to remind you, it's not in one day that the change happens, it's just a gradual chipping away, one thing after the other. In such a way also that the faith itself then is attacked. So you have a situation where in many areas, in practice, people, from children onwards, are not fully aware of what they're doing and what's being done before them. And so it is easy to see then how the big dynamic is so human that all that matters is that we all are equal and have a share and participate and do something all the time, and there is no inequality. Basically, it's become hugely, if not totally, human. And the attack on the sacred is just massive. So, where does that leave us? Unfortunately, it can leave us, if we're not careful, in the middle of it, colluding with it. One needs to be aware, for instance, just to be concrete on one or two areas, that the will of God is contained in this volume with regard to the way he wants to be honoured. It's both the general instruction, which is now more clear than it was in 1969, because all the details have been cleared up because of the 50 years of experience, and also in the central part where we have the bits in red. Rubric is something written in the colour red. So they are actually expressions of what? What the Old Testament would be for the scribes and those who were experts of the law. And the Lord did not come to abolish, but this was only the shadow of that. Therefore we have the fullness and therefore a greater obligation. And the pedagogy of the details of this would come therefore in their fullness in that. As the Lord indicated at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, He did not come to abolish, but to bring to completion, to fulfill. And we have in the Old Testament many indications of certain things which the Lord did not necessarily mean to completely dismantle. And it was perceived as such in the continuum which happened in the early church, and which one finds gently going on in both East and West, until fairly recently in the West, but still ongoing in the East. Therefore, when one sees things coming in the West, which are not imagined in the East, and which were never imagined in the early church, and never imagined in the Jewish setup, it means that we need to question ourselves. Because the will of God, as I say, when it's positive, is such, and when it's in the permissive form, is allowing certain things to avoid other things getting worse. In other words, the church is trying to handle a situation which has crept in. So I just want to zoom into one point. The question of the Lord's will with regard to who should do what. Just recently, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has formally made a declaration that the definition given in Ordinatio Sacerdotalis of St. John Paul II with regard to the impossibility of ordaining a female is actually definitive and part of church doctrine, irreformable. It's a clear declaration, but only indicating what John Paul II indicated himself, and could not be put back on the drawing board. But it's not stopping there. We need also to be aware that there's a lot of cheap scholarship going round, almost in tabloid form, to get a point. One can actually see around what's going on now with regard to people unaware of this huge bulldozer of history and divinely led tradition from earliest times before the Incarnation itself, to try and get in place something which was not actually dreamt of. In the early church, we know from earliest sources, St. Ignatius of Antioch amongst them, writing only 50 years after St. Paul, that the threefold system of bishop, priest and deacon was already there in place. The bishop was the central figure, and there had to be union around him. The deacons were always there from the beginning and are in Scripture, and their role was always clear. But the other bit, the presbyterate, was the one that oscillated in the writings of the early church. It only becomes clear at Antioch at that point. It then becomes clear throughout the church, but there is a problem in some of the elasticity of going from one word to the other, episkopos to presbyteros. But that's another historic question. What is clear is this: the deacon was always there, and he was right next to the bishop. And often, per saltum, the deacon would become a bishop, and even a pope. But the question comes in, what about the ladies? Now, there are two words in Greek. Diakonos is masculine. You can make it feminine by making it diakone. But we have in the early church diakonisse coming in. It's a different word. And it simply means a minister. For naked women at baptism. That was their role, and also facilitating various things, but not actually in the presbyteram, with actually the area from the earliest times designated only to the clergy. And in the early church structure, you can see them still in Rome, the ancient churches, it's quite clear where the central clergy were and no one else. And there was always the understanding that it was the male, because their proximity to the actual ordination is there, and often they'll be on the way there. And by the way, we need to recuperate the notion of even the sacrality of the reader and cantor. Early roles, and they were ordained as such, lectors. And it's an important role, because these are the kind of ministries that should be uplifted and made what they are, with good preparation on the spiritual and on the actual practical level, because people are not nourished quite often because it's too hurried. So the question of the ministry of cantors was very important in the early church and still is in the East. This too is the kind of ministry that we wanted to see reevaluated at the Second Vatican Council. But what happened? This indirect way of making it equal for all and everyone having a right to do everything, it brought down what? First of all, that anyone eventually could come into the sanctuary dressed in everyday clothes, which takes away straight away from what Ezekiel already saw and what has always been there for 2,000 years, that only vested in a certain way one would approach the Holy of Holies. That was a given already in the Old Testament. And also that leads to what? Mentally, when one does the same thing with the same clothes, with the same banality as one would do in the kitchen with the same people involved, mentally it's a huge change over a period from one little bit of chipping away to one end product. It's massive. So, who won? There's an old saying in legal Latin, is fecit cui prodest. He did it to whom it served.